Everyone said his cabin would freeze. They didn't whisper it. They said it plainly, confidently, the way people speak when they believe the answer is already settled. In northern Montana, winter was not something you experimented with. It was something you survived, or didn't. And survival depended on rules that had been passed down without question. One of those rules was simple: metal and winter did not belong together. Metal was cold. Metal was dangerous. Metal would kill you faster than bad wood or thin walls ever could. That belief was so deeply rooted that no one bothered to question it. No one, except Edwin Cortland. Edwin was not a loud man. He didn't argue for the sake of winning. He didn't enjoy being different. He simply paid attention. And after 2 winters in Flathead County, what he had seen terrified him more than the opinions of his neighbors. He had watched strong men burn through mountains of firewood and still wake up to frost crawling across their walls. He had watched mothers wrap children in blankets that did nothing but slow the inevitable chill. He had watched cabins groan, shift, and crack as the cold forced its way inside. And he had watched the same solution fail again and again. Edwin's first winter had been brutal. He built his cabin exactly the way he was told. Thick lodgepole pine logs, carefully selected and seasoned. Chinking made from clay, straw, and moss, pressed tightly into every gap. The cabin was positioned with its narrow end facing north, just like the guidebooks recommended. A stone hearth sat at the center of the main room, built wide and deep so it could hold heat long after the fire died down. Edwin followed every instruction because that's what a responsible man did when his family's life depended on it, and still, the cold came in through places he couldn't see. Through hairline gaps that opened when the logs contracted at night. Through seams that looked tight in daylight but breathed once the wind picked up. The cabin felt alive in the worst way, inhaling cold air and exhaling warmth into the darkness. Edwin woke every morning feeling like the night had stolen something from him. Heat. Strength. Hope. By February of that first winter, the fire never went out. Edwin slept in short stretches, waking every 2 or 3 hours to add wood. His hands cracked and bled. His back ached constantly. Margaret's face stayed pale, and the children learned to stay close to the stove, even when it meant cramped space and restless sleep. The second winter was worse because now they knew what to expect. The novelty of frontier hardship had worn off. There was no romance left in frozen water buckets and numb fingers. Edwin worked harder that year, cutting more wood, stacking more cords than he thought they would ever need. It still wasn't enough. By midwinter, his youngest daughter began coughing at night. It wasn't loud at first. Just a soft, dry sound that echoed too clearly in the cold air. Margaret tried everything. Warm tea. Extra blankets. Sitting by the stove until her legs went numb. The cough lingered. Edwin lay awake listening to it, staring at the ceiling, knowing that cold didn't just make people uncomfortable. It killed them slowly, one winter at a time. That was when Edwin stopped trusting tradition. He started watching how the cold behaved instead of how people talked about it. He noticed how wind pressed against the cabin, searching for weakness. He noticed how the walls felt cold to the touch even hours after the fire burned hot. He noticed how quickly warmth disappeared the moment the stove went quiet. And he realized something that no one around him wanted to say out loud. Their houses weren't losing because winter was too strong. They were losing because their buildings were flawed. A log cabin looked solid, but it was full of movement. Wood expanded when it warmed and shrank when it cooled. Every cycle created gaps. Chinking dried out and crumbled. Even stone hearths leaked heat if the surrounding structure couldn't hold it. The cabin wasn't a barrier. It was a filter point. One afternoon in town, Edwin stood near the rail yard waiting for supplies when his attention settled on a grain storage building nearby. It was wrapped in corrugated galvanized steel. Snow slid off its sides. Wind screamed past it. And still, the structure stood unmoved, sealed, quiet. Edwin walked closer and pressed his hand against the wall. The metal was cold, yes, but the building didn't breathe. It didn't leak. It didn't shift. That image followed him home. Metal conducts cold, everyone said. But metal also blocks wind. It reflects radiant heat. And unlike wood, it doesn't crack open under pressure. Edwin began thinking about what really made homes cold. It wasn't temperature alone. It was air movement. It was exposure. It was loss. What if metal wasn't the enemy? What if it was armor? Edwin didn't imagine replacing the logs. He respected the strength of wood. Logs had mass. They stored heat well when protected. The problem was exposure. If he could shield the logs from direct wind and weather, if he could stop air from forcing its way through the walls, the logs might finally do what they were meant to do. The idea formed slowly, carefully. A second skin. Metal on the outside, logs on the inside, and between them, a layer of still air. Air that wouldn't move. Air that wouldn't steal heat. If moisture appeared, it would need a way to escape. Ventilation mattered. Drainage mattered. Edwin knew a mistake here wouldn't just fail. It would rot the cabin from the inside. He measured. He planned. He thought about it at night while listening to the wind. He pictured how snow would shed, how rain would run, how air would rise and fall inside the cavity. This wasn't guesswork. It was problem solving. When he finally rode into town and bought the galvanized steel sheets, the store owner assumed he was building a barn. When Edwin said it was for his house, the man paused, frowned, and said nothing more. By the time Edwin returned home, word had already begun spreading. People came by under the excuse of curiosity. They leaned on fence posts. They crossed their arms. They shook their heads. And they warned him, metal freezes, they said. You're building an ice box, that thing will kill your family. The most respected builder in the county said it loud enough for others to hear. 5 words that carried weight. That thing will kill your family. Edwin didn't respond. He nailed wooden furring strips vertically along the outside of the logs, spacing them carefully. 1 inch thick. Enough to create separation, not enough to waste space. Then he fastened the metal sheets to the strips, overlapping them from bottom to top so snow and rain would slide away. He drilled small holes at the bottom to let moisture drain. He left gaps at the top so air could move upward and out. The cabin transformed. It didn't look like a home anymore. It looked industrial. Cold. Wrong. Margaret watched quietly, worry etched into her face. This wasn't how she imagined raising children. This wasn't how neighbors lived. She trusted Edwin, but trust didn't silence fear. By January, winter arrived early. The cold settled in and didn't leave. Wind howled across the valley, tearing heat from every surface it touched. Cabins groaned. Doors froze shut. Frost bloomed across interior walls like white vines. Inside Edwin's cabin, something unexpected happened. The fire burned lower than before. Slower. Edwin noticed he didn't need to feed it constantly. The warmth stayed. The walls no longer felt like ice. When the fire died down overnight, the temperature barely dropped. Margaret woke up and realized her breath wasn't visible. The children stopped clustering around the stove like moths to a flame. Days passed. Then weeks, outside, neighbors worked themselves to exhaustion hauling wood. Inside Edwin's cabin, life slowed down. Meals lasted longer. Sleep came easier. The coughing faded. By February, the cold deepened into something historic. -40. -43. Trees split apart from the sound alone. Livestock froze where they stood. Families abandoned cabins and crowded into town buildings, sharing space just to stay alive. Edwin's chimney smoked lightly, not constantly. His woodpile shrank slowly. People noticed. A pastor rode out to check on families. He expected to find disaster behind the metal walls. Instead, he stepped inside and felt real warmth. Not survival warmth. Comfort. The children played barefoot. Margaret baked bread. The walls were dry. Warm to the touch. Measurements were taken. 70 degrees. Sometimes more. The numbers didn't lie. The men who warned Edwin came next. They expected trickery. Luck. Some hidden detail. They found none. The fire was modest. The design simple. The results undeniable. One by one, certainty collapsed. That spring, Edwin answered questions. He showed neighbors how to build the air gap. How to ventilate. How to overlap the metal. He asked for nothing in return. The next winter, metal appeared across the valley. Firewood use dropped. Frost disappeared. Warmth stayed. Everyone said his cabin would freeze. It became the warmest house anyone had ever known, and the lesson lasted longer than the metal itself. Tradition feels safe, but physics doesn't care about tradition. Cold doesn't care about opinions. Only what works survives. Sometimes the smartest thing a person can do is ignore the laughter and trust what the numbers prove. The winter finally loosened its grip in late March, but the memory of it did not fade when the snow began to melt. People carried that winter with them in their bones. They carried it in the scars on their hands from splitting frozen logs, in the coughs that lingered long after the cold retreated, and in the quiet fear that settled whenever the wind picked up. For the people of Flathead County, the winter of 1891 became a dividing line. There was life before it, and life after it. And standing at the center of that line was one metal-sided cabin that was never supposed to work. When the thaw came, neighbors finally had time to think instead of simply react. They compared wood piles. They compared exhaustion. They compared sickness. And again, the same truth surfaced. Edwin Cortland's family had not just survived. They had lived normally through a winter that nearly broke everyone else. At first, people talked about it cautiously. No one wanted to admit they had been wrong too quickly. It is easier to blame luck than to admit a belief was flawed. Some said Edwin must have had better wood. Others claimed his stove was different. A few insisted the winter winds must have shifted somehow, sparing his property while punishing others. But none of those explanations held up for long. When spring came, Edwin opened his cabin for anyone who wanted to look. He didn't advertise it. He didn't invite crowds. He simply didn't refuse. Men came in pairs at first, quiet and serious, running their hands along the walls, peering behind the stove, inspecting the corners where frost usually gathered. They found nothing mysterious. No hidden insulation. No secret fuel source. Just metal, air, and careful thinking, James Hollister, the builder who had warned Edwin the loudest, returned alone one afternoon. He didn't bring tools or notebooks this time. He brought silence. He stood in the yard for a long time, looking at the metal siding, watching how sunlight hit it, how water from melting snow ran cleanly down the panels instead of soaking into the wood beneath. He walked the perimeter slowly, like a man circling a question he wasn't ready to ask. Inside, he ran his hand along the logs again. They were dry. Solid. No soft spots. No signs of rot. He tapped them with his knuckles and listened. The sound was firm, confident. Wood that had been protected instead of punished. Hollister finally spoke, not loudly, not publicly, but honestly. He asked Edwin how long he thought the logs would last like this. Edwin answered simply. Decades. Maybe longer. Without direct exposure, the wood wouldn't crack, wouldn't soak, wouldn't fail the way traditional cabins always did. Hollister nodded slowly. For a man who built his reputation on tradition, that answer landed like a blow. That spring, Hollister changed the way he talked to clients. He didn't abandon log cabins. He didn't insult the old ways. But when families asked how to make their homes warmer, he mentioned metal. Carefully. Quietly. As an option. Something worth considering. Not everyone listened. Some people clung hard to tradition, especially those who had built their identity around it. A cabin wasn't just shelter. It was proof of toughness. Proof that you could endure what the land threw at you. To admit that a thin layer of metal could outperform years of inherited knowledge felt like an insult. Those men said warmth was earned through work, not design. They said suffering built character. They said winter was meant to hurt. Edwin didn't argue with them either. He stayed busy helping those who asked. He showed them how to install furring strips. He explained why ventilation mattered more than thickness. He warned them not to nail metal directly to the logs. He repeated the same thing every time. The metal wasn't the solution by itself. The system was. Why the next fall, metal siding appeared on a handful of cabins. Some wrapped only their north-facing walls, the ones that took the worst wind. Others went further, covering entire structures. There were mistakes. One family skipped ventilation and dealt with moisture problems until Edwin helped them correct it. Another installed too narrow an air gap and didn't see full benefits. But even imperfect attempts showed improvement. Winter returned, not as brutally as 1891, but cold enough to test every claim. The difference showed quickly. Families with metal siding burned less wood. Not a little less. A lot less. Fires burned lower. Nights were quieter. Frost stopped appearing on walls. Children slept better. Mothers worried less, and those who refused to change noticed something else. They noticed how tired they were compared to their neighbors. They noticed how often they needed help hauling wood. They noticed how often their houses felt empty because families were staying elsewhere just to stay warm. Pride weakened when faced with numbers. By the winter of 1893, metal siding was no longer strange. It was discussed openly. The hardware store in town kept more galvanized sheets in stock. Orders came in from homesteaders miles away who had heard stories and wanted details. Some people called it Cortland cladding. Others just called it the warm wall. Edwin never corrected anyone. He didn't name it. He didn't claim ownership. He believed good ideas didn't belong to people. They belonged to those who needed them. Margaret noticed the change in the community before Edwin did. Women who once spoke to her with pity now asked questions with respect. How much wood did you burn last winter? Did you have any mold? Did the metal make noise at night? Was it worth the cost? Margaret answered honestly. Yes, it made noise in high winds sometimes. A low hum, like distant singing. No, there was no mold. Yes, it was worth every penny and every sideways look. The children felt the change too. They no longer heard whispers about their strange house. Other children talked about wanting metal on their cabins. Warm houses became something to admire instead of something to mock. Edwin's oldest son began helping neighbors install siding. He learned spacing, fastening, sealing. He learned why overlap mattered. He learned that building wasn't just about strength. It was about understanding forces you couldn't see. By the mid-1890s, the technique spread beyond Flathead County. Letters traveled. Word of mouth carried faster than newspapers. Homesteaders in Wyoming and Idaho wrote asking for details. Edwin replied when he could. Short letters. Clear explanations. No exaggeration, the idea adapted. Some areas used different metals. Some widened the air gap. Some added interior insulation as well. But the principle stayed the same. Stop wind. Control air. Protect mass. Years passed, winters kept coming, and every year, the difference repeated itself. Cabins with metal siding aged better. Logs stayed straight. Corners stayed tight. Repairs became rare. Firewood piles grew smaller. Time returned to people who once spent every spare moment cutting, hauling, and burning. Edwin grew older quietly. His hair grayed. His children grew strong. They remembered winters as something uncomfortable, not deadly. That alone was a gift few frontier families could claim. Sometimes, on the coldest nights, Edwin would sit by the stove and listen to the wind strike the metal walls. The sound reminded him of the laughter, the warnings, the certainty he had walked past without fighting. He didn't feel bitter. He felt grateful that he had trusted observation over noise. He never thought of himself as brave. He thought of himself as tired of losing. The cabin stood for decades. The metal weathered and dulled. The logs behind it remained solid. Long after Edwin was gone, people still talked about the winter that changed everything. They talked about how close they came to disaster. And they talked about the men who wrapped his house in metal when everyone said it would freeze. Everyone said his cabin would freeze. It didn't. It taught them that survival doesn't belong to the loudest voice or the oldest rule. It belongs to the idea that works when tested hardest. Time has a way of softening arguments that once felt sharp and unmovable. What people refuse to believe at first, they often accept quietly later, once the noise has faded and only results remain. That is what happened in Flathead County. No announcement marked the change. No meeting was called. No official statement declared Edwin Cortland right. Instead, year after year, winter did the speaking. Each cold season returned like a judge who could not be argued with. Each time the temperatures dropped and the wind pressed hard against every structure in the valley, the difference showed itself again. Cabins that relied only on tradition suffered. Cabins that had adopted the metal shell endured. It became impossible to ignore, even for the most stubborn men. Firewood was the first measure people noticed. It was the easiest thing to count. Men who once cut until their shoulders burned now finished early. Woodpiles that once vanished by January lasted well into March. Some families stopped stockpiling altogether, cutting only what they needed as winter progressed. Time, once swallowed by survival, slowly returned to them. That extra time changed lives in small but important ways. Men repaired tools instead of rushing from one chore to the next. Women spent less time fighting damp cold and more time cooking, sewing, and resting. Children learned without numb fingers. Sickness declined. The long winter coughs faded faster each spring. These changes were quiet, but they added up. Cabins themselves told the story too. Structures wrapped in metal aged differently. Logs stayed straight. Corners stayed tight. Roof lines didn't sag from repeated freeze-thaw cycles. When storms passed, the metal shed snow and rain instead of holding it against the wood. Maintenance became rare instead of constant. Cabins stopped feeling temporary. Even those who resisted change couldn't deny one truth. Their neighbors' homes looked the same year after year, while theirs needed repairs again and again. Pride has limits, especially when exhaustion crosses them. Some of the last holdouts were men who had lost something to winter in the past. A child. A wife. A brother. They clung to tradition not because it worked, but because changing it felt like admitting that loss might have been avoidable. Edwin understood that pain, even if they never spoke of it. He never pushed them. He never said, "I told you so." He waited. Eventually, even they asked. When they did, Edwin didn't hesitate. He walked them through the same steps he had shown everyone else. He explained the air gap again. He explained ventilation again. He reminded them that metal alone was not the answer. The system mattered more than the material. Some listened closely. Some nodded without fully understanding. But they tried. By the turn of the century, the sight of metal-sided cabins no longer raised eyebrows. New settlers arriving in the region assumed it was standard practice. They built that way from the start, unaware that the method had once been mocked as deadly. What had been radical quietly became normal. Edwin's children grew up warm, and that alone set them apart from many others. They remembered winters as cold, but not frightening. They remembered quiet evenings around the table instead of long nights pressed close to the stove. Those memories stayed with them as they left home and built lives of their own. His oldest son carried the knowledge west, building his own cabin using the same ideas, adjusted for new winds and weather. His daughter married a carpenter who listened carefully to Edwin and began using metal cladding in his work long before anyone asked for it. In this way, the idea spread quietly, passed through families rather than books or speeches. Edwin never became famous. He never traveled or tried to sell his idea. He stayed home, working the land and fixing what needed fixing. When asked why he never profited from it, he simply smiled. Cold, he believed, did not care who owned an idea. Survival worked best when knowledge was shared. Over the years, the metal on his cabin dulled and blended into the land, but the logs beneath stayed strong. When repairs were made, the wood was found as solid as ever, still surprising people decades later. Edwin outlived many who once laughed at him. When he died, there was no monument or plaque. But nearly every home in the valley carried a piece of his thinking. Winter still came hard, but fewer families feared it. Fewer children fell sick. All because one man refused to accept the usual answer. Everyone said his cabin would freeze. It never did. And long after he was gone, the warmth continued to speak for him.